There's this really cool movement happening right now in front of your eyes, and you're ignoring or rejecting it just because it doesn't fit into this strictly narrow definition of punk? What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we're talking about a very special label, Epitaph Records. Discord, SST, Revelation, Fueled by Ramen, Nuclear Blast, Metal Blade. The list of legendary labels in punk, metal, and hardcore goes on and on and on. There's a ton of them. Those are all great labels, don't get me wrong, but Epitaph stands out to me as the one label that has done more to support punk than any other label in history. And they've been doing it for 40 years, 4 decades. In this video, I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by all that, but first, don't forget to check out the Punk Rock MBA podcast. It's live now on all platforms. And also, I want to thank Star Trek Fleet Command for sponsoring this video. Star Trek Fleet Command is a massive, super deep, strategic MMO for iOS and Android. It's free to play, and let me tell you, there is a lot to this game. If you're a fan of the Star Trek universe, then you are going to be stoked because they really pull a lot from the lore. You can recruit all the famous characters you know, like Spock and Kirk. You can build all the iconic starships like the Enterprise and Klingon D4 class. And if you're like me and you are into super deep systems, then you're going to love that side of things in this game. There's a bunch of different mission types, super deep research trees for all the different kinds of technology like warp drive and shields. You've got a station with different components to upgrade, like a Starfleet Academy, resource processing facilities. You can upgrade several different systems on each of your ships. You can recruit officers and train them in different ways. And that's just scratching the surface. That's not even getting into the community aspect where you can call in support from your online friends. So if that sounds cool and you want to support the channel, well, you know what to do. Download Star Trek Fleet Command at the link in the description. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. And I'm kind of broadly dividing their career up into 5 eras, the first of which is the early years, from roughly 1981 to 1989. As most of you guys know, Epitaph was started by a Bad Religion's guitarist and co-founder Brett Gurewitz, basically as a vehicle to release their music. The first release was Bad Religion's 7-inch back in 1981. And the second Epitaph band after Bad Religion was the Vandals, one of my favorite bands of all time. They put out Peace Through Vandalism in 1982. And by the way, if you haven't listened to the Vandals, you are seriously missing out. Probably my favorite punk band of all time. They also put out some other stuff like the first L7 album and some kind of weird bands like Thelonious Monster that kind of never really got any traction. So although they were technically a label, it seemed like more than anything else, they just kind of existed to put out Bad Religion's music. What really put them on the map as a label was the next era, where they just absolutely exploded and really, in my opinion, defined that whole generation of punk. But before I get into that part of their history, let me just kind of zoom out a little bit and first talk a little bit about what punk actually means, at least to me, and why I think Epitaph embodies that more than any other label.
Punk is a movement. It's a musical and cultural movement.
To me, punk is not like any one specific moment in time. You know, like there's people that think unless your band sounds like the Sex Pistols did in 1977 and you wear bondage pants and whatnot, that you're not real punk. And to me, to put it bluntly, I think those people are full of shit. To me, the definition of punk is simple. It's whatever the current generation of disaffected, fucked up, pissed off kids is doing. And that's why I love Epitaph, because more than any other label, they've consistently, over 40 years, supported whatever form punk is taking at the moment. Even when that meant taking a lot of shit for it, which trust me, they did, and I'll talk about in more detail. For now, let's get on to the next era. The skate punk era from roughly 1990 to 96 or so.
Life is the crummiest book I ever read. There isn't a hook.
Now, I don't know what was happening behind the scenes or where Brett's head was at or any of that stuff, so I can't comment on that, but what I can say is that this is when Epitaph really exploded. The big thing in punk during this era was unquestionably the whole skate punk thing, and I made a whole video about that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it here, but I'm talking about NOFX, Bad Religion, No Use for a Name, Pennywise, all that kind of stuff. And although there were some other labels that were part of it, the two that absolutely dominated this era were Fat Records and Epitaph. And there's kind of an interesting dimension to that in that even though Fat Records was Fat Mike from NOFX's label, his band was on Epitaph. And I think of NOFX's album Ribbed as the one album that's kind of the start of the skate punk era. That came out on Epitaph in 1991. Although you can make the argument that it started a couple years earlier because, as the guys in NOFX will tell you, their essentially sonic blueprint was the Bad Religion album Suffer that came out in 1988, also on Epitaph.
I give you me, I give you nothing.
But any way you want to look at it, this was just an absolutely massively successful period for Epitaph. This is when they put out Smash by the Offspring, which went 6 times platinum. That is 6 million copies sold. And also And Out Come the Wolves by Rancid and Punk In Drublic by NOFX, both of which went platinum and were massively influential in the scene. As well as a lot of other albums by bands like Pennywise that maybe didn't quite hit that level of commercial success, but were still big hits by punk standards.
Take your deals and go away.
And you might think, holy shit, that's so cool. They sold millions of albums by these legit punk bands, got millions of kids all over the world into punk. That's awesome. And I would agree with you on that, but that is the exact opposite of how the real punks at the time reacted to it. They absolutely hated all that shit. They hated Epitaph. In their eyes, those were the least credible bands that you could possibly listen to in the early to mid 90s. To these guys, the punk gatekeepers, this stuff was trendy garbage for like snowboard bros and posers who shop at the mall. They looked at skate punk back then the way that they would probably look at like emo rap now. And as I go on, you'll notice that this is a recurring theme in the Epitaph story. That every time they move the ball forward for the culture, instead of getting a pat on the back for it, they get a bunch of hate.
It's my job to keep up Rocky Lee.
With that said, if you look at their discography during this period, it's pretty fucking amazing. Aside from the stuff I mentioned a minute ago, a few of my personal favorites that I wanted to kind of call out because I don't think they get the attention that they deserve. Proud to Be by DFL. Riches to Rags by RKL. Four on the Floor by Dag Nasty.
I've got nothing but time, so I'm still waiting.
And 60 Cycle Hum by Pulley.
Nothing left for me. Nothing left for me.
And I also want to give a shout out to the Punkorama comps that they started releasing around this time because those things did a lot for the genre. There's literally millions of kids around the world that got into punk because of those comps. Pretty cool. And I guess I should also mention Millencolin because that band's fans are total punishers, and if I don't, I'm gonna get a million comments about
Why no mention of Millencolin?
So there you go. Here's your mention of Millencolin.
I'm falling in love with you.
So this was an absolutely massive era for Epitaph, but what followed was, in my opinion, probably their weakest period.
'Cause we're faster than the world, we're faster than the world, we're faster than the world, we can't slow down.
That brings us to the third era in Epitaph's history, what I'm calling the limbo years, from roughly 1997 to 2002. And again, I don't know what was going on behind the scenes. I don't know how well the label was doing from like a business perspective. But if I had to guess, I would say that they were probably still making a shitload of money from all the stuff they put out during the previous era. But even so, even if they were doing well financially, I feel like this is the one point in their history where they kind of didn't really have their finger on the pulse of what was happening in punk. Because when I think of the most innovative, interesting stuff that was happening in the like late 90s, early 2000s, to me, that would be the rise of like the metallic hardcore, post-hardcore, and emo bands. Bands like Hatebreed, Saves the Day, Get Up Kids, Texas is a Reason, Quicksand, all that kind of stuff. And looking back at how that all kind of played out, I would have to say that probably labels like Victory and Revelation and Equal Vision probably won that round. Because if you look at what Epitaph was doing during this time, it was mostly just putting out more records by the same bands that worked for them during the skate punk era, like album 4, 5, or 6 from a skate punk band. And those weren't bad by any means, and I'm sure they sold well. It just wasn't really on the cutting edge of what was happening in punk at the time. And so it looked to me from the outside like Epitaph was maybe going to be one of those labels that was like in the right place at the right time, caught a trend wave, rode the shit out of it, and then the ride was over once that trend ran its course. Like Rise did with metalcore, like Lookout did with East Bay pop punk, like Drive Through did with their whole flavor of pop punk. It looked like Epitaph was going to be that, but for skate punk. But what Epitaph did next proved me wrong and showed me that they were on another level. Which brings us to era number 4, what I'm calling the core years, from roughly early 2003 to probably 2020.
Hello, Thurman. It's your first day of school.
This is where Epitaph showed that it was more than one of those labels that was tied to like one specific scene or moment in time. This is where they showed that they weren't like the skate punk label, that instead they were the label that supported punk in whatever form that happened to be taking at the moment. And I call these the core years because to me, post-hardcore and metalcore were easily the most interesting things happening at that time under the broader heading of punk. And although they kind of missed the boat on the previous wave of post-hardcore and emo, they absolutely nailed it on this one. To me, their comeback, if you want to call it that, starts in 2003 when they put out Matchbook Romance and From First to Last, followed by signing Converge in 2004 and then doing the American distribution for Bring Me the Horizon, a band that at the time nobody took seriously but would obviously go on to become incredibly important. And that was just the beginning. They were just getting started. Over the next 15 years, they followed that up with an absolutely ridiculous lineup. To name just a few: Escape the Fate, Parkway Drive, Set Your Goals, The Ghost Inside, I Set My Friends on Fire, Sleeping with Sirens, Falling in Reverse. The list goes on and on and on. I can't possibly list all of them here, but go look it up. It is absolutely ridiculous how strong their discography was during this period. And to me, this was exactly the same dynamic as what you saw during the skate punk period. These were the defining bands for this whole generation of alternative youth culture, or otherwise known as punk. They were the ones moving the culture forward, innovating, getting millions of kids all over the world into this stuff. And yet, again, as I've talked about endlessly in my other videos, the reaction from the older generation was the same as it was during the skate punk era.
That's not punk. You guys don't have mohawks. You don't sound like the Verukers. You're not punk.
Which, ironically, is kind of exactly what makes it punk in my eyes. I mean, what is more punk than pissing off the previous generation of punks?
Hot Topic is not punk rock.
And by signing those bands, what Epitaph proved to me is that they support the spirit of punk. That they believed in it at a truly fundamental level, not just the one particular version of it that happened to exist in 1980 when they started. And that's exactly why Epitaph earned my respect so much during these years. I mean, it would have been so easy for Brett to turn into yet another punk rock old man screaming in a cloud, right? Or, I guess more accurately, the Principal Skinner meme.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
It makes me so happy to see that there's people like him and Kevin Lyman who have been there since the beginning, but understand that punk is not something that's frozen in time, that they support the spirit of punk as it continues to change and evolve over time. It really bums me out how traditionalist the punk community can be. I mean, if you don't personally enjoy the music that the current generation of kids are making, that's fine, you don't have to. But to me, shitting on them and discouraging them because they're doing something that isn't exactly the same as what you did when you were their age, like, that's about the least punk thing imaginable. And also, by the way, who the fuck are you to tell Brett Gurewitz or Kevin Lyman what is and isn't punk? Of all people. And also, I should note, they never stopped putting out their traditional punk albums either. Throughout that whole scene era, they were still putting out records by bands like Total Chaos, Dropkick Murphys, Rancid, Pennywise, Millencolin, Agnostic Front. So it's not at all like they walked away from their roots. In fact, it's more like they held on to their roots, but also brought in and embraced a whole new generation along with it. That said, as much as I love what they did during this era, during the core era, what really cemented Epitaph's status in my eyes as the one label that's done more to support punk than anyone else is what they've done really just in the last 6 months or so. And I know that there's already some people ready to disagree with me, but hear me out.
And even if I never get in a pit anymore, I kind of still identify as a punk, because that's my roots.
That brings us to the fifth and current era of Epitaph's history, what I'm calling the cloud punk years, starting really in 2020. If you've watched my other videos, then you know that I'm a big supporter of what's going on in the, I guess for lack of a better term, alternative rap world. I've talked before about how I see that stuff as the new incarnation of metal and punk and hardcore, starting a couple years ago with artists like Ghostmane, Bones, Suicide Boys, Lil Peep, and more recently artists like City Morgue, Shinigami, 93 Feet of Smoke, and Fatsy, among many others.
Lil Zip got the devil in a headlock. Lil Silly got the devil in a leg lock.
And the reason I love that stuff is because it just could not be more clear to me that that is where the spirit of DIY punk and hardcore is coming from right now. There's this huge wave of cool, creative kids making like weird shit in their bedrooms and basements, and yet because it's just a little bit sonically different than what came before it, it's pretty much completely ignored by the punk establishment. And so most of these artists have been operating DIY, partly because they don't give a fuck, they know how to promote themselves, and they don't really need a label. And then coming from the other side, the labels for the most part haven't been able to sign these guys because they don't get it. Which is really disappointing to me because like there's this really cool movement happening right now in front of your eyes and you're ignoring or rejecting it just because it doesn't fit into this strictly narrow definition of punk. So dumb. I mean, there's been a handful of signings, but for the most part, this stuff has been operating outside the label system. And that is why I was so happy and impressed to see Epitaph pick up a handful of these guys. First, Lil Lotus and guccihighwaters, who I talked about in this video a little while ago. And most recently, Nascar Aloe, who is just like so obviously a punk kid that to me, it's absolutely insane that anybody could think otherwise. I mean, look at this kid.
Oh, I told the pole just like a hockey stick. Talking shit, see that I'm a punk and now they jocking it.
Signing these guys is what proved to me that Epitaph supports the real spirit of punk. What they've done again and again and again is give a voice to the current generation of kids that are making fucked up music that pisses off the establishment. And what's more punk than that? And of course, just like the skate punk era and just like the scene era, the punk establishment absolutely hates all this stuff too. I mean, look at any of the comments on the videos from Epitaph's channel and you'll see what I'm talking about. It's just so embarrassing to me to see so-called punk fans acting like this, being like the biggest gatekeepers. But that's okay, they're gonna get the last laugh because just like they were historically correct in the past, they're gonna be correct about this stuff too. When you're an innovator like they are, it always takes people a while to catch up, but they always do. Set yourself a reminder to check on this if you don't believe me. 10 years from now, the gatekeepers are gonna be saying,
What the hell is this crap? Back in my day, we had real music like Nascar Aloe and guccihighwaters.
So just to bring it all home, that is 40 years of supporting the spirit and culture of punk in all its many different forms. And I really can't think of anybody else that's done that. There's some other labels out there who I definitely could see getting there someday. Fueled by Ramen comes to mind, but only time will tell because as of now, Epitaph is the only one who's done it for 40 years, and so to me, for that, they get the crown. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. I'd love to know what you think in the comments. Let me know what you think about Epitaph and about this whole idea of them consistently innovating, getting hate for it, being proven right, and then that cycle just repeating again and again and again. Also, if you haven't yet, please check out the Punk Rock NBA podcast. There's a link to that in the description. We've got a new episode coming out every Monday, and I would love it if you check it out. I also want to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon. It is because of your support that we are able to do the podcast. Because of all of you, especially those of you who support us at the true cult level or above, I've been able to hire a producer and editor, and without her help, I cannot do this. So thank you all very much for your support. I sincerely appreciate it. If you are interested in supporting on Patreon, there's a link to that in the description as well. Patrons get all the podcasts a week early. I do Q&As. There's an opportunity for me to review your band or YouTube channel or podcast or any other creative project that you want to submit to me. So if that sounds interesting, check it out at the link below. And also, before I let you go, I'm going to hit you with one more thing. If you want to talk about business with me, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm going hard on LinkedIn. A lot of cool shit happening over there. And if you follow me there, you'll see why. So if you want to talk business, add me on LinkedIn. There's a link to that in the description. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.